Gabriel's shift at the hospital had finally come to an end. After hours of back-to-back surgeries, exhaustion weighed heavy on his shoulders. It was past midnight as he drove through the dimly lit streets of São Paulo, his thoughts clouded with the day's stress. All he wanted was to collapse into bed and escape the chaotic day behind him. The rhythmic flicker of streetlights passed over his windshield, and the quiet of the city seemed to mirror the isolation he felt within. But that solitude was abruptly shattered. In the distance, Gabriel spotted thick smoke rising into the night sky, illuminated by the eerie glow of orange flames. He blinked, his mind trying to process what he was seeing. A fire, somewhere close. His first instinct was to ignore it. After all, the fire department must have already been called. But something about the scene gripped him. His foot lifted off the accelerator as he neared the source, his pulse quickening. The blaze engulfed a cluster of small homes, humble, old constructions that looked like they could collapse at any second. The air felt hot, even from a distance. As Gabriel pulled over, the sight before him was chaotic. Neighbors were shouting, some standing helplessly as flames consumed the structure. His hand hovered over his phone, ready to call for help, but the wailing sirens of approaching fire trucks told him they were already on their way. Then, a sharp, desperate cry pierced the night. Help! Someone's still inside. Gabriel's heartbeat thundered in his ears. People had gathered, but no one dared approach the inferno. Instinct kicked in, and without thinking, he sprinted toward the burning house, ignoring the cries telling him to stop. The heat hit him like a wall as he reached the front door, but the thought of someone trapped inside made retreat impossible. He kicked the door with all his strength, feeling it crack under the impact. Black smoke poured out, suffocating him as he stepped inside, but he pushed forward. "Where are you?" he yelled into the darkness, though his voice was barely audible over the roar of the flames. He squinted, scanning the burning interior, then heard it, a faint, choking sound. There, in the far corner of the room, barely visible through the smoke, lay an old woman. She was struggling to move, coughing weakly as the fire encroached on her. Without hesitating, Gabriel rushed to her side, his eyes stinging and lungs burning. She was too weak to stand, her frail body trembling from fear and exhaustion. "Hold on, I've got you," he gasped, lifting her carefully into his arms. The fire crackled louder, like a living beast closing in on its prey. The temperature around them soared as the ceiling began to buckle. Gabriel's vision blurred, and the path to the exit felt impossibly long. Each step was a fight against the heat, the weight of the woman, and the thick smoke that filled his lungs. But he couldn't stop now, not when they were so close. Just as his legs threatened to give out, a deafening crash echoed behind them. A part of the roof collapsed. The shockwave nearly knocked him off balance, but the surge of adrenaline pushed him forward. He stumbled through the doorway, coughing and gasping as fresh air hit his face. Outside, a crowd of onlookers erupted in cheers, but Gabriel barely registered the noise. He set the woman down on the sidewalk, kneeling beside her, desperately checking her pulse. She was alive, barely conscious but breathing. A wave of relief washed over him. Paramedics rushed forward, immediately tending to the woman as Gabriel staggered backward, his body finally giving in to the exhaustion. He collapsed onto the curb, his vision spinning, though his focus remained on the woman as they placed her on a stretcher. The rush of what he had just done swirled in his mind. What made me do that? He wondered, his breaths shallow. Gabriel was no hero. He was a surgeon, used to saving lives in sterile, controlled environments, not running headfirst into burning buildings. As he sat there, catching his breath, his eyes were drawn to something on the ground. It was a photograph, scorched along the edges, but still intact enough to reveal the faces in it. Gabriel picked it up out of curiosity. The image was old, faded, but as his eyes focused, his heart nearly stopped. He recognized one of the women in the photo. It was his mother, younger, standing beside the elderly woman he had just rescued from the fire. Gabriel sat on the curb, the flickering lights of the fire trucks illuminating the street in bursts of red and blue. His heart still raced, but it wasn't just from the heat of the flames or the adrenaline of the rescue. His eyes remained locked on the photograph clutched in his hand, as if it held the answers to questions he didn't even know he had. He stared at the image, the shock slowly settling into confusion. His mother, there was no mistaking her, was standing beside a younger version of the elderly woman he had just saved from the burning house. They looked happy, smiling as if the world hadn't yet unleashed its tragedies upon them. But this didn't make sense. Gabriel's mother had died when he was just a child, and he had no memory of this woman. How could she have known his mother? The sound of a fireman calling out snapped him from his daze. "Sir, are you okay?" the firefighter asked, stepping toward him. Gabriel quickly folded the photograph and slipped it into his pocket, nodding numbly. "Yeah, I'm fine," he muttered, standing up on shaky legs. He glanced at the ambulance where paramedics were still attending to the old woman. She was stable now, though her face was pale, her body weak from the smoke inhalation. Gabriel wanted to approach her, ask her about the photo, about her connection to his mother, but this wasn't the time. She needed medical attention, and pressing her for answers now felt wrong. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than a coincidence. There was something deeper, something hidden in the past that he had never known about. His mind raced as he watched the ambulance drive off, taking the woman to the hospital where he had just left hours earlier. Gabriel got back into his car, his hands still trembling slightly as they gripped the steering wheel. The route home felt longer than usual, every streetlight casting shadows that seemed to mirror the questions swirling in his mind. Why was my mother in that photo? Who is this woman? As he pulled into his apartment complex, the quietness of the parking garage did little to ease his nerves. He needed answers, and the only clue he had was now lying crumpled in his pocket. Gabriel stepped into his apartment, the sterile, orderly space offering none of the comfort it usually did. He paced the floor for a moment, trying to piece together fragments of memories that refused to surface. Eventually, he sat down at the kitchen table, pulling the photograph out again. He smoothed it on the surface, his eyes tracing the familiar features of his mother. She had the same warm smile he remembered, the one she wore when tucking him in at night. But who was the other woman? There was only one way to find out. Without wasting another second, Gabriel grabbed his coat and rushed back to his car. He needed to be at the hospital when the woman regained consciousness. If she had known his mother, she might be able to explain everything. His heart pounded with anticipation as he sped through the city streets, heading back to the place he thought he had left behind for the night. When he arrived at the hospital, he found it buzzing with the usual late-night activity. Nurses moved swiftly through the halls, doctors gave quiet orders, and the occasional sound of machines beeping filled the air. Gabriel made his way to the emergency wing, scanning the area for any sign of the woman. He spotted her through a small window, lying in a hospital bed, hooked up to oxygen but stable. Her eyes were closed, her chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. The sight of her brought back the image of the flames, of carrying her out into the street, and now, seeing her safe, Gabriel felt a strange sense of relief. He waited, watching the clock tick as the minutes dragged on. His mind raced through possibilities, trying to imagine what connection this woman had to his mother. The silence in the room felt heavy, each passing second tightening the knot in his chest. Then, the woman stirred. Her eyelids fluttered before slowly opening, and she blinked against the harsh light of the hospital room. Gabriel felt his pulse quicken. He knew he shouldn't push her too hard, but he couldn't leave without answers. He knocked gently on the door and stepped inside. "Ma'am," he began softly, unsure of how to frame the question. "I don't mean to intrude, but do you remember me? I'm the one who pulled you out of the fire tonight." The woman turned her head slowly, her eyes meeting his. For a moment, she seemed disoriented, but then recognition flickered in her gaze. "Yes," she whispered, her voice raspy. "You saved me, thank you." Gabriel hesitated, then pulled the photograph from his pocket, holding it up where she could see it. "Do you recognize this?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "That's my mother. And you're in this picture with her." The woman's eyes widened as they focused on the photo. Her hand trembled as she reached up, her expression shifting from confusion to shock. A long pause stretched between them, and Gabriel could see her mind working, as if old memories were being unearthed from deep within. "That's impossible," she muttered, her eyes now filled with a deep sorrow. Gabriel's heart raced faster. "Please," he urged, "tell me what you know." The woman's voice was barely a whisper when she spoke again. "I thought you'd never find out, but I guess it's time." She paused, gathering her strength. "Your mother and I, we were family. I'm your aunt, Gabriel." The words hit him like a physical blow. He took a step back, the room spinning. His aunt? But she had died in a car accident years ago. How could this woman be standing here, alive? Gabriel's mind reeled, but one thing was clear. Everything he thought he knew about his family was about to change forever. Gabriel stood frozen, the woman's words echoing in his mind. "I'm your aunt." The hospital room seemed to shrink, the air thickening with the weight of what she had just revealed. His aunt? No, it couldn't be. He had been told she died years ago, along with his parents in that tragic accident. How could this woman, this stranger, be his aunt? Gabriel's voice came out in a whisper, barely able to contain the whirlwind of emotions building inside him. "That's impossible. My aunt died. She was in the car with my parents when they—" He stopped, the sentence too painful to finish. The woman, frail and weak, stared back at him with eyes that carried a lifetime of sorrow. "That's what you were told, I know. But the truth, Gabriel, is far more complicated." His pulse quickened. Everything he thought he knew about his past felt like it was crumbling in real time. Right there in that small hospital room, he took a seat by the bedside, his heart pounding in his chest. "Explain," he demanded, though his voice was gentle, almost pleading. "I need to understand. How are you still alive? Why did I think you were dead?" The woman, his aunt, shifted slightly in her bed. Her eyes glazed over as if she were looking into a distant past. She sighed deeply, the effort to speak seeming to drain her. But she knew Gabriel deserved the truth. "I was in that car with your parents," she began, her voice strained but steady. "We were driving back from a family gathering, just like you remember. The accident, it was horrific. I blacked out after the impact. When I woke up in the hospital days later, I was told that your parents were gone. They didn't survive." Gabriel swallowed hard, the memory of his parents' sudden loss still fresh even after all these years. He had been a child, left to grow up with only fragmented memories of them. But now, hearing this woman recount the story in such detail stirred something deep inside him. "They told me I was dead too," she continued, her voice cracking. "At least, that's what your father's side of the family decided. They wanted a clean break, to leave the tragedy behind. There were legal battles over the estate, custody of you. It was a mess. And me? I was erased." Gabriel's hands gripped the edges of his chair. "Erased?" he repeated, his mind struggling to comprehend how someone could just be erased from their family, their life. "Why?" She closed her eyes, as if the weight of the truth was too much to bear. "Your father's side of the family was wealthy, influential. There were secrets, things they didn't want coming to light. They offered me money to disappear, to start over, and I was too broken to fight. I left, and you were told I had died along with your parents." Gabriel stared at her, trying to process the enormity of what she was saying. His life had been built on lies, on a foundation of half-truths and secrets hidden away. "But why now? Why didn't you come back? Why didn't you tell me before?" The woman's eyes filled with tears, her hands trembling as they clutched the bed's railing. "I was ashamed, Gabriel. I was a coward. I should have come back, but I convinced myself you were better off without me. You had a life, a family that took care of you. And I had nothing left." Gabriel's chest tightened with a mixture of anger and sorrow. His entire life had been shaped by the loss of his family, by the belief that he was alone. And now, after all these years, the truth was sitting in front of him, wrapped in the fragile body of a woman who had once been part of his world but had let him believe she was gone. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I never meant for you to find out this way. But fate, it seems, had other plans." Gabriel looked down, his thoughts a tangled mess. He had spent his life searching for answers, for meaning, in the absence of the family he lost. And now, In the most unexpected way, he had found one missing piece of that puzzle. But it wasn't the answer he expected, nor the one he wanted. The silence between them stretched on, thick and heavy. He could hear the distant hum of hospital machines, the shuffle of nurses in the hall. But in that room, the only thing that mattered was the weight of what had been said. Finally, Gabriel spoke, his voice steadier now, though still laced with emotion. "You're my family. Whatever happened, whatever choices were made, that doesn't change the fact that you're my family." The woman's tears spilled over, her frail hand reaching out toward him. Gabriel hesitated for just a moment before taking her hand in his. It felt foreign, yet familiar, like a distant memory he could barely grasp. He looked at her, seeing the pain and regret etched in her features. "I have so many questions," he admitted, his voice softer now. "There's so much I don't understand." She nodded, her fingers squeezing his hand weakly. "I'll tell you everything, Gabriel. There's more, so much more. But for now, just know this. I loved your mother, and I've never stopped thinking about you." Gabriel closed his eyes, the flood of emotions too much to handle all at once. He had come to the hospital seeking answers, but the ones he received left him with more questions than ever. He knew this was only the beginning. If his aunt had been hidden from him all these years, what else was out there? What other truths had been buried with his family? When he opened his eyes again, his resolve had hardened. He had to uncover the rest of the story, everything that had been kept from him. He stood, his mind already racing ahead to the next step. "I'll be back," Gabriel said quietly, releasing her hand. "There's more I need to know. But for now, rest." His aunt nodded, her tears drying as she watched him leave the room. As Gabriel walked down the hospital corridor, the photograph still tucked in his pocket, one thing became painfully clear. This was just the beginning of a truth far darker and deeper than he had ever imagined. Gabriel left the hospital in a daze, his mind racing with the weight of what he had just learned. His aunt, alive, after all these years. And the stories she had shared, about his father's family erasing her from their lives, leaving him to believe she had died alongside his parents. It was all too much to process. His whole life had been constructed around a tragedy that now seemed shrouded in lies. As he drove through the quiet streets of Sao Paulo, the city lights blurred past him. The photograph felt heavy in his pocket, like it carried the key to unraveling the dark history of his family. But his aunt's words played on repeat in his mind. "There's more, so much more." Gabriel knew he couldn't stop now. He had only scratched the surface, and the deeper he went, the more he would uncover. But with every revelation came more questions, and the one that haunted him the most now was the fate of his brother. He had no memory of a brother, but his aunt's revelation that he had a twin shook him to the core. How could he have a sibling, a twin, and not know? Who had kept this from him, and why? The thought made his stomach churn, and as the car came to a stop outside his apartment building, Gabriel knew he wouldn't rest until he found the answers. The next morning, after a night of fitful sleep, Gabriel returned to the hospital. He was anxious to see his aunt again, hoping she had regained more strength to fill in the missing pieces of the puzzle. As he walked into her room, the sunlight spilling through the window seemed to cast a warmth that belied the cold truths they were about to revisit. She was awake, sitting up in her bed, her face pale but alert. When she saw him, a soft smile touched her lips, though her eyes still carried the weight of guilt and sadness. "Gabriel," she greeted, her voice a little stronger today. "I was hoping you'd come back." He nodded, pulling up a chair beside her bed, his heart pounding with anticipation. "I need to know everything," he said, his voice firm but calm. "You told me I have a brother, a twin. Why didn't I know about him? What happened?" His aunt sighed, her eyes dropping to her lap as if the story she was about to tell was too painful to relive. She took a long breath before speaking, her voice low and steady. "When the accident happened, it didn't just take your parents, it shattered our family. There were fights over who would take you and your brother. Your father's family. They didn't want the responsibility of raising two boys after such a tragedy. They saw an opportunity, a way to make the burden lighter. So they separated you too." Gabriel felt a chill run through him. The idea of being deliberately separated from his twin brother, as if they were just problems to be solved, made his chest tighten with anger. Separated us? He echoed, disbelief creeping into his voice. Where did he go? Who took him? After the accident, I wasn't in a position to fight for you both, she continued, her voice trembling with regret. Your brother. He was given up for adoption. It was all arranged behind closed doors. I was barely conscious when they decided everything. By the time I recovered, it was too late. He was gone. Gabriel's fists clenched, the rage inside him threatening to boil over. They gave him away? His voice shook with fury. Without telling me? Without even giving us a chance to grow up together? His aunt's eyes brimmed with tears, her hands shaking. I'm sorry, Gabriel. I wanted to tell you, but I was powerless back then. Your father's family had too much influence. They wanted to control everything, including your lives. They thought it was better if you didn't know, less complicated that way. Gabriel stood up, pacing the room, his mind racing with questions he couldn't yet answer. He was overwhelmed, angry, and confused, but more than anything, he was determined. What happened to him? Where is he now? I don't know, his aunt whispered, her voice full of sorrow. I never knew where they sent him. All I know is that he was adopted through an agency, a private one. I don't have any records, no names. They made sure to keep everything buried. Gabriel's mind was already moving to the next step. He couldn't just leave it at that. There had to be records somewhere. Even if the adoption was arranged through secretive channels, someone would know where his brother had gone. Do you remember the name of the agency? He asked, his tone urgent, his eyes locked on hers. She nodded weakly. It was called Horizon Adoptions. But Gabriel, that agency was shut down decades ago. They destroyed most of their records. You might not find anything. Her words felt like a punch to the gut, but Gabriel refused to let that stop him. He wasn't going to give up, not now. His brother was out there somewhere, living a life Gabriel had no part of, and the thought of that, of what could have been, haunted him. He straightened, resolve hardening in his chest. I'll find him, he said quietly, but with absolute certainty. No matter what it takes, I'll find him. His aunt looked at him with a mixture of pride and sadness. I wish I could help you more, she said softly. But you're going to face obstacles, Gabriel. There were powerful people involved, and they won't want the past to resurface. Be careful. Gabriel nodded, though his mind was already spinning with plans. He thanked his aunt and left the hospital, his steps brisk as he walked to his car. The name Horizon Adoptions echoed in his head. Even if the agency had been shut down, there had to be some trace of it left. He could start by searching old records, trying to find any survivors of the agency who might still have information. His next stop was his office, where he had access to resources that could help him dig deeper. Being a surgeon came with its privileges, and Gabriel was ready to use every connection he had to uncover the truth. As he sat down at his desk, he quickly began searching through archives and databases, determined to find any lead on the defunct adoption agency. Hours passed in front of the screen, each search bringing him closer but not quite close enough. Frustration mounted as one dead end followed another. But then, something caught his eye. A news article from years ago, detailing a scandal involving Horizon Adoptions. Corruption, illegal adoptions, records mysteriously vanishing. It seemed the agency had been involved in far more than just placing children into loving homes. Gabriel leaned back in his chair, his mind reeling. The adoption had been illegal. His brother's life had been shaped by something dark and corrupt, and Gabriel had no idea what kind of man he had become. But one thing was clear. He couldn't stop now. His family's secrets had been buried for too long, and if his brother was part of that, Gabriel owed it to both of them to find the truth, even if it meant unraveling a web of lies that stretched further than he could imagine. And for the first time in years, Gabriel felt something unfamiliar flicker inside him. Hope. Not just hope for answers, but hope that maybe, just maybe, he could put his broken family back together. Gabriel could feel the weight of the truth bearing down on him as he stood outside the hospital, the sun setting low on the Sao Paulo skyline. The revelation about his brother gnawed at him like an open wound. A twin brother he never knew existed, separated from him at birth, raised in a completely different world. His fingers brushed against the edges of the folded photo still in his pocket, the connection to his mother that now seemed fragile in the face of this overwhelming mystery. Determined, Gabriel headed back to his apartment. His mind buzzed with the new information. Horizon Adoptions, a name that now carried the promise of answers, but also the heavy possibility of more pain. The scandal around the agency, the illegal adoptions, the vanished records, it all pointed to a web of corruption and deceit. Gabriel had a sinking feeling that finding his brother wouldn't be simple, but he couldn't stop now. Sitting at his desk, Gabriel combed through more articles and documents late into the night. Every thread he pulled on seemed to lead to more tangled knots. There were whispers of powerful people involved, shady deals made to sweep everything under the rug. Yet, no names, no concrete leads. It was as if the agency had been erased from existence, much like his aunt had been. Frustration gnawed at him, but he pushed through, refusing to let exhaustion take over. Then, something caught his attention. An old case file, a lawsuit filed against the agency just before it shut down. The name listed as the complainant was a former employee, someone who had worked inside Horizon Adoptions during its final years. Gabriel's heart pounded as he read through the details. The woman, Elena Duarte, had tried to expose the agency for illegal adoptions, but her case had been dismissed when the agency folded, leaving her allegations buried under a pile of legal threats. Gabriel stared at the name on the screen, hope surging inside him. If anyone knew where to find his brother, it was her. The next morning, Gabriel wasted no time. Armed with the little information he had, he tracked down an address for Elena Duarte. It wasn't far, a small neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. As he drove, he felt a mixture of anticipation and dread. This woman might hold the key to finding his brother, but what would that reveal? What kind of life had his brother been living all these years? The neighborhood was quiet, a far cry from the busy streets of downtown Sao Paulo. The houses here were modest, old, but well kept. Gabriel parked outside a small, run-down apartment building and approached the door, his pulse quickening with every step. After a few knocks, the door creaked open slightly, and a woman peered out. She was in her late 50s, her face lined with years of worry and exhaustion. Her eyes narrowed suspiciously as she took in the sight of Gabriel. "Yes?" she asked, her voice guarded. "Elena Duarte?" Gabriel asked, his voice steady despite the nerves building inside him. "I'm Gabriel. I need to talk to you about Horizon Adoptions." The woman's face changed instantly, her eyes widening in alarm. She started to close the door, but Gabriel held up his hand, desperation edging into his voice. "Please wait. I think you know something about my brother. He was adopted through that agency, and I'm trying to find him." Elena paused, her hand frozen on the doorframe. There was a long, tense silence before she sighed and opened the door a little wider. "Come in," she said quietly, stepping aside. Gabriel followed her into the small, dimly lit apartment. The walls were lined with old photographs and stacks of papers. It smelled of dust and the faint scent of old wood. Elena gestured for him to sit at the small kitchen table, and she took a seat across from him, her eyes studying his face carefully. "You look like someone," she said after a moment, her voice soft. "You remind me of someone from back then. My mother, maybe?" Gabriel said, pulling the photo from his pocket and sliding it across the table. "This was taken years ago. My mother is the one on the left. The woman next to her is my aunt, who I just found out is alive." Elena's gaze softened as she looked at the photo. She nodded slowly. "Yes, I remember them. They came to the agency once. That was long before everything fell apart." Gabriel leaned forward, his voice urgent. "Please, tell me what you know. My brother was given up for adoption through Horizon. They wiped all the records clean, but there has to be something left, some way to find him." Elena hesitated, her fingers tracing the edges of the photo. "After the agency shut down, they did everything they could to cover their tracks, but I managed to keep some files. I didn't think anyone would ever come looking for the children again. Most of them were adopted into families with powerful connections, the kind of people who could make problems disappear." Gabriel's heart raced. "Do you have anything on my brother? Any clue where he might be?" Elena stood slowly and walked over to a small, worn filing cabinet in the corner of the room. She opened a drawer and began sifting through a collection of old papers, her movements deliberate and cautious. Gabriel watched her, his body tense with anticipation. After what felt like an eternity, she pulled out a thin, yellowed folder and handed it to him. "I don't know if this will help," she said softly, her eyes heavy with the weight of the past. "But it's all I have left." Gabriel opened the folder, his hands trembling slightly. Inside, there were a few faded documents, names, dates, signatures. His eyes scanned the page quickly until he found it. A name, barely legible, written in the margins of one of the papers. It wasn't his brother's name, at least not the one he would have had at birth, but it was something, a new identity given to his brother after the adoption. Lucas Andrade. Gabriel stared at the name, the realization settling over him like a heavy fog. This was it, his brother's new life, his new name. But who had he become under that name? What kind of life had he lived? Elena spoke softly, breaking the silence. "I don't know where Lucas ended up after the adoption. The family that took him, they had connections, and they didn't want anyone digging into their past. I'm sorry I don't have more." But to Gabriel, this was enough. He finally had something, a name, a starting point. It wasn't much, but it was a thread he could follow. And he knew he wouldn't stop until he pulled it all the way to the end. He thanked Elena, his mind already racing with plans on how to track down Lucas Andrade. As he left the apartment and walked back to his car, Gabriel felt a strange mix of emotions, hope, fear, and a simmering dread. He had found the first real lead in his search for his brother, but something told him that what lay ahead would be far more complicated and dangerous than he had anticipated. Gabriel gripped the steering wheel tightly as he drove away from Elena's apartment, his mind racing with the newfound name echoing in his thoughts, Lucas Andrade. His brother was out there, living under a name Gabriel had never heard until today. The weight of it sat heavy on his chest. His hands were still trembling as he thought about how close he was to uncovering the truth, but also how far he still had to go. He pulled over to the side of the road, taking a deep breath as the quiet of the early morning wrapped around him. The streets were empty, the world just beginning to stir, but Gabriel couldn't stop. There was no rest to be found, not with this new name burning in his mind like a beacon. He grabbed his phone and started searching, typing in Lucas Andrade and hoping for a lead. There were countless results. People, businesses, social media accounts. It was overwhelming. Gabriel ran a hand through his hair, frustration building. His brother could be any one of these people, or none of them at all. The trail was cold, and the world suddenly felt impossibly large. But Gabriel wasn't one to give up easily. He dialed a number, calling in a favor. One of his colleagues at the hospital had connections in the legal world, someone who could access databases that weren't available to the public. If Lucas had left a trace, Gabriel would find it. After an anxious wait, his phone buzzed with a response. It was a hit, a Lucas Andrade who fit the timeline of his brother's adoption. But what made Gabriel's stomach churn was the note attached to the name. Lucas had been associated with criminal defense cases involving some of the most powerful and dangerous people in the city. It wasn't just that Lucas was a lawyer. He was defending individuals linked to organized crime. Gabriel's heart sank. This wasn't what he had expected. His brother hadn't just disappeared into an ordinary life. He was deeply enmeshed in a world of corruption, the very kind that had likely facilitated his adoption in the first place. The thought of it made Gabriel's skin crawl, but he knew he couldn't turn back now. He had to find Lucas, no matter what kind of man he had become. His first step was tracking down Lucas's office. It was located in one of Sao Paulo's upscale business districts, a towering glass building that reflected the sky, its sleek exterior hiding the darker dealings inside. Gabriel parked a few blocks away and stared at the building, his stomach in knots. He wasn't sure what he would say when he found Lucas. How do you tell someone that they're your brother, stolen from you at birth? But he couldn't wait any longer. Walking into the lobby of the building, Gabriel felt out of place. The people around him were polished, sharp suits and briefcases, while he wore the fatigue of sleepless nights and emotional strain. He approached the receptionist, trying to hide his nerves. "I'm here to see Lucas Andrade," Gabriel said, his voice steady but laced with urgency. The receptionist gave him a skeptical look before typing something into her computer. "Do you have an appointment?" Gabriel shook his head. "No, but I need to speak with him. It's urgent." "I'm sorry," she replied curtly. "Mr. Andrade doesn't take walk-ins. You'll need to schedule a meeting." Gabriel clenched his jaw, fighting the urge to demand to see Lucas right then and there. But causing a scene wouldn't get him anywhere. He thanked the receptionist and stepped outside, frustration gnawing at him. He needed another way in. As he stood outside the building, thinking of his next move, his phone buzzed again. It was a text from the colleague who had helped him earlier. There was more information, details that deepened Gabriel's concern. Lucas wasn't just representing criminals. He had been linked personally to figures known to be deeply entrenched in Sao Paulo's underworld. This wasn't just a legal connection. Lucas was in bed with dangerous people. Gabriel's chest tightened. What had happened to his brother? Was this the life he had been forced into? Or had he chosen this path willingly? Gabriel's mind raced with questions, but he knew that he couldn't approach Lucas directly without causing suspicion. He began following Lucas's schedule, observing from a distance, hoping to find a moment where they could speak without the presence of bodyguards or criminal associates. Days passed in a blur of waiting and watching. Gabriel felt like a ghost, shadowing a man he had never met, but who shared the same blood. It was a strange, surreal feeling, being so close, yet so far from the brother he never knew. Finally, the opportunity presented itself. Late one evening, Lucas left the office alone, his usual entourage of security nowhere to be seen. Gabriel's heart pounded as he followed him down a quiet street. The city buzzed with life around them, but Gabriel's focus was entirely on the man walking just a few feet ahead of him. Taking a deep breath, Gabriel called out, "Lucas." Lucas turned, his expression sharp and guarded. For a moment, Gabriel saw something in his eyes. A flicker of recognition, perhaps, or maybe just the wariness of someone used to living in a world full of enemies. He was taller than Gabriel expected, with a well-groomed appearance that screamed power and control. But underneath it, there was a coldness, a hardness in his gaze that made Gabriel's blood run cold. "Do I know you?" Lucas asked, his voice cool and controlled. Gabriel stepped closer, his heart hammering in his chest. "My name is Gabriel. I think we need to talk. It's about our family." Lucas's eyes narrowed. "Our family?" he repeated, his voice dripping with suspicion. "I don't have any family." Gabriel felt the sting of those words but pressed on. "That's what you were told, but it's not true. You were adopted, Lucas. We were separated at birth. You're my brother." For a split second, Gabriel saw the mask of control on Lucas's face falter. But it was brief, and almost immediately, Lucas's expression hardened again, his eyes narrowing into slits. "I don't know what game you're playing, but I don't have time for this." Gabriel's frustration bubbled to the surface. "I'm not playing any game, Lucas. You were stolen from me, taken from our family after the accident. I've been searching for you. You have to believe me." Lucas's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Gabriel thought he saw a flash of something. Doubt. Maybe? Regret? But it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "I don't know who you are, and I don't care," Lucas said, his voice colder than before. "Whatever you think you know about me, you're wrong. And I'd suggest you stay out of my life before you get yourself into something you can't handle." With that, Lucas turned and walked away, leaving Gabriel standing in the middle of the street, his heart heavy with the weight of rejection. He had found his brother. After all these years, he had finally found him, but Lucas didn't want to be found. As Gabriel watched Lucas disappear into the shadows of the city, a sinking realization settled over him. His brother wasn't just lost to him. He was trapped in a world of lies and danger, and pulling him out wouldn't be easy. But Gabriel had come too far to stop now. No matter how deep Lucas was in, no matter how dangerous the people he was involved with, Gabriel knew one thing. He wouldn't abandon his brother again. Gabriel watched his brother disappear into the city, his heart heavy with the sting of rejection. He stood there, frozen, trying to process everything that had just happened. After all these years of searching, after uncovering the dark secrets of their family and the adoption agency, he had finally found Lucas. But it wasn't the reunion he had imagined. His brother had looked at him like a stranger, cold and detached, unwilling to believe the truth. Gabriel's mind raced. How had they ended up so different? Two brothers, born into the same family, separated by tragedy, and now living worlds apart. One a surgeon who saved lives, the other entangled in a dangerous underworld of crime and corruption. But despite the rejection, despite Lucas's harsh words, Gabriel couldn't walk away. His brother was lost, but Gabriel had come too far to let him stay that way. The city lights flickered around him as he turned and made his way back to his car. The streets were alive with people, but Gabriel felt utterly alone. He climbed into the driver's seat and stared out at the bustling streets. He had to find another way to reach Lucas. If words wouldn't convince him, then maybe actions would. Over the next few days, Gabriel threw himself into learning everything he could about Lucas's life. He reached out to contacts, followed up on leads, and began piecing together the world his brother now inhabited. What he discovered was worse than he had imagined. Lucas wasn't just representing criminals. He was involved with them on a personal level. The deeper Gabriel dug, the clearer it became that Lucas was tied to powerful figures in Sao Paulo's underworld. Figures who wouldn't hesitate to silence anyone who got too close. But Gabriel was determined. He knew that if he didn't act, Lucas would be consumed by this world, beyond saving. He couldn't let that happen. One evening, as Gabriel sat in his apartment, poring over documents and names linked to Lucas's clients, his phone buzzed. It was a message from his contact at the hospital, a friend with access to private investigative resources. The message was short but alarming. Found something you need to see. Urgent. Meet me tonight. Gabriel's pulse quickened. He grabbed his coat and headed out, the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. He met his contact in a dimly lit cafe on the outskirts of the city. The man slid a file across the table without a word. Gabriel opened it, his eyes scanning the contents, and what he saw made his blood run cold. It was an old police report, a report on a crime that Lucas had been involved in years ago. Gabriel's breath caught in his throat as he read the details. Lucas had been part of a cover-up, protecting a notorious crime boss who had been linked to multiple murders and illegal dealings. But it wasn't just the crime itself that horrified Gabriel. It was the fact that Lucas had been personally tied to this man, someone who had likely pulled him into this world of corruption and control. Gabriel's hands shook as he closed the file, his mind spinning. He had come into this search hoping to find his brother and reconnect, but what he had found was a man who had been dragged into a life of crime, likely manipulated and controlled by people far more dangerous than Gabriel had anticipated. "Are you sure about this?" Gabriel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His contact nodded grimly. "Lucas is in deep. If you're going to get him out, you need to be careful. These people don't play games. They'll come after anyone who threatens them." Gabriel's heart sank. He had hoped to reason with Lucas, to convince him to leave this life behind. But now he realized the stakes were far higher than he had imagined. If Lucas was tied to these people, getting him out wouldn't just be difficult, it would be deadly. As Gabriel left the cafe, the weight of the situation bore down on him. He knew he couldn't just walk into Lucas's life and expect him to leave everything behind. Not when his brother was tied to people who would do anything to protect their empire. But Gabriel wasn't ready to give up. There had to be a way. Over the next few days, Gabriel continued his search for a way to reach Lucas. He kept his distance, knowing that if he got too close, he might endanger them both. But he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Every day that passed, Lucas was being pulled deeper into this world, and Gabriel feared that soon, he would be too far gone to save. One night, while Gabriel sat in his darkened apartment, lost in thought, there was a knock on the door. His heart skipped a beat as he cautiously opened it. Standing on the other side was a man Gabriel didn't recognize, dressed in a dark suit, his expression cold and unreadable. "Dr. Gabriel?" the man asked, though it was clear he already knew who Gabriel was. "Yes," Gabriel replied, his voice tense. The man stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "Lucas told me about you. Said you've been asking questions. It would be wise if you stopped." Gabriel's blood ran cold. He had expected danger, but now it was standing in front of him, in his own home. "I'm not going to stop," Gabriel said, his voice firm. "Lucas is my brother. I'm not leaving him in the hands of criminals." The man's eyes flashed with a dangerous glint. You don't understand how things work, Doctor. Lucas is exactly where he belongs. And if you keep pushing, you're going to get hurt. Or worse. Gabriel's heart pounded, but he refused to back down. I'm not afraid of you, he said, though his voice wavered slightly. Lucas deserves to know the truth about who he is. He deserves to have a chance at a real life. The man's lips curled into a chilling smile. And you think you can give him that? You're nothing more than a nuisance, someone who doesn't know when to walk away. If you want to keep breathing, I suggest you do exactly that. With that, the man turned and walked away, leaving Gabriel standing in his doorway, shaken but resolute. He closed the door, his hands trembling as the gravity of the situation sank in. This was bigger than he had realized. Lucas wasn't just a pawn in a corrupt system. He was deeply entrenched in a world that would stop at nothing to protect its secrets. Gabriel knew then that he couldn't do this alone. He would need help if he had any hope of saving Lucas from the people who controlled him. But even as he made plans to seek out allies, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was running out of time. His brother's life, and maybe his own, depended on what he did next. Gabriel sat in his darkened apartment, his mind racing with the chilling words of the man who had just left. The threat had been clear: back off, or face the consequences. But Gabriel couldn't let it end like this. Lucas was his brother, and despite the danger, Gabriel wasn't going to abandon him to a life of crime, manipulation, and corruption. He knew that confronting Lucas again wouldn't be enough. Lucas was too deeply entangled in this world, too guarded by the walls he had built around himself. Gabriel needed to show Lucas the truth in a way that couldn't be ignored, a way that would force him to confront the lies he had been living. But how? Gabriel's mind flicked back to the documents Elena Duarte had given him. The paperwork that showed Lucas's adoption had been part of an illegal operation. Gabriel had to use this to expose the truth, not just to Lucas, but to the people who controlled him. He knew it was a dangerous plan, but it was the only way to break Lucas free from their grasp. The next morning, Gabriel took a deep breath and began making calls. He contacted a journalist he trusted, someone who had a history of exposing corruption in Sao Paulo's underground. The risk was enormous, but Gabriel knew that if he didn't act now, Lucas might be lost forever. He arranged a meeting for later that day, determined to take the first step toward bringing everything to light. As the afternoon wore on, Gabriel drove to the outskirts of the city to meet the journalist, a woman named Mariana, at a quiet cafe far from the prying eyes of the people watching him. She was sharp, inquisitive, and known for getting to the bottom of stories no one else would touch. Gabriel had worked with her once before, but this time the stakes were personal. "So, what's this about?" Mariana asked as she sat across from Gabriel, her eyes narrowing as she sipped her coffee. "You sounded pretty urgent on the phone." Gabriel slid the file across the table, his heart pounding in his chest. "It's about my brother. He was adopted through an agency called Horizon Adoptions, an illegal adoption ring that's been covered up for decades. Lucas, my brother, was taken from me after our parents died in an accident, and he was raised in this corrupt system. He's involved with people who are part of Sao Paulo's criminal underworld now. I need your help to expose them." Mariana's brow furrowed as she opened the file, her fingers flipping through the yellowed documents. Her expression shifted from curiosity to disbelief. "These are serious allegations," she said quietly, her voice thick with concern. "If this is true, you're talking about people who won't hesitate to silence anyone who threatens them." Gabriel nodded, his jaw tight. "I know, but I can't let Lucas stay in their control. This is the only way to break him free." Mariana looked at him for a long moment, weighing the risks. Finally, she sighed and leaned back in her chair. "All right, I'll help, but we need to be smart about this. We can't just throw these accusations out there without backing them up. We need more proof." Gabriel's mind raced. Elena Duarte, the woman who used to work for Horizon, might have more. She already gave me this, but if we dig deeper, maybe we can find the smoking gun. Mariana nodded. "We'll start there. But be careful, Gabriel. Once we start pulling at this thread, it's going to unravel quickly, and people are going to come after you." Gabriel thanked her and left the cafe, a sense of urgency building inside him. He knew the risks, But he also knew that every second he waited, Lucas was slipping further into the life that had been forced on him. There was no turning back now. That evening, Gabriel returned to Elena's apartment, hoping to find more evidence that could bring Lucas's true past to light. But when he arrived, something was wrong. The door to her apartment was ajar, and inside, the place had been ransacked. Papers were strewn across the floor, furniture overturned. Panic surged through Gabriel as he stepped inside, his heart pounding in his chest. "Elena!" he called, his voice tight with fear. But there was no answer. Gabriel searched the apartment, dread building with every step. Elena was gone. Someone had gotten to her first. Gabriel cursed under his breath, realizing that the people who had warned him to stop must have made their move. They were trying to erase every trace of the past, to bury the truth once again. His phone buzzed, and Gabriel snatched it from his pocket, hoping it was Elena. But it wasn't. It was Lucas. Gabriel hesitated for a moment before answering. "Lucas?" There was silence on the other end, and then Lucas's voice came through, low and cold. "I told you to stop digging, Gabriel. You didn't listen." Gabriel's heart sank. "Lucas, listen to me. This isn't about me. This is about you. You were lied to your whole life. You were stolen from our family." Lucas's voice remained icy, as if Gabriel's words had no effect on him. "I don't care about the past. The people I work with, they don't care either. But what they do care about is loyalty. And you're making things very difficult for me." Gabriel's frustration boiled over. "Lucas, they're controlling you. They've been controlling you since you were a child. This isn't who you are. You deserve to know the truth." But Lucas wasn't listening. "I'm giving you one last warning," he said, his voice edged with danger. "Walk away now, or the next time we talk, it won't be a conversation." The line went dead, and Gabriel stood there in the wreckage of Elena's apartment, his heart pounding with fear and anger. Lucas wasn't just rejecting him, he was threatening him. Gabriel felt like the world was closing in around him, the danger far more real and immediate than he had anticipated. He knew he had to act quickly. Lucas was in deeper than he had thought, and now Gabriel was in the crosshairs of the same people. If he didn't find a way to expose the truth, and soon, both of them might not survive what was coming. Gabriel left the apartment, his mind racing with a new plan. He couldn't wait for Lucas to come to his senses. He needed to take the fight directly to the people who had corrupted his brother's life. If he could expose them, if he could bring down the empire that controlled Lucas, maybe, just maybe, he could save him. But as Gabriel made his way back to his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced over his shoulder, scanning the darkened street, but saw no one. Still, the uneasy feeling stayed with him. The game had changed, and Gabriel knew that from now on, every step he took could be his last. Gabriel's heart raced as he stared into the shadowed eyes of his brother, Lucas, standing rigid in the dimly lit warehouse. The tension between them was palpable, a mix of years of pain, loss, and the widening gap between their lives. Gabriel had risked everything to reach this moment, to bring Lucas out of the darkness that had consumed him. But now that they were face to face, it felt like the world was hanging by a thread. Lucas stood in silence, his body tense, as if deciding whether to listen or walk away for good. The weight of their shared past seemed to press down on them, filling the empty space around them. Gabriel took a deep breath, fighting to keep his voice steady. "You don't have to do this anymore," Gabriel said, his words filled with urgency. "Whatever they've made you believe, whatever control they have over you, it doesn't matter. You have a choice. We can end this." Lucas's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. "You don't get it, Gabriel. You don't understand the things I've done. It's not as simple as just walking away." "I know what you've done," Gabriel replied, stepping closer, his eyes locked on Lucas's. "I've seen the files. I've uncovered the truth about your adoption, about everything. But that doesn't mean you can't make a different choice now. You're not trapped." Lucas's eyes flickered with something. Regret, anger, maybe even hope. But it was buried beneath layers of hardened emotion. "I've built a life here," he said quietly, almost to himself. "It's all I have. You think you can just walk into my world and offer me a way out? These people don't let you go, Gabriel. They kill you. Or worse. Gabriel took a step closer, his voice low but filled with determination. I don't care what it takes. I'm not losing you again. For a moment, Lucas looked at him, really looked at him, as if seeing his brother for the first time. The cold mask he had worn for so long cracked, and beneath it, Gabriel saw the boy he had once imagined growing up alongside. But the fear and guilt in Lucas's eyes told a different story. A story of survival in a world where trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. They'll come after you too, Lucas said, his voice shaking slightly. You don't know what you're getting into. These people are dangerous, Gabriel. You don't want to be a part of this. I'm already a part of this, Gabriel countered, stepping closer until he was standing just a few feet away from Lucas. I've been a part of it since the day they took you from me. I'm not going to stop until we're both free from them. Lucas stared at him, his expression conflicted, as if torn between the loyalty he had built to survive and the faint hope of redemption. Gabriel could see the battle happening inside his brother, the walls that Lucas had spent years building up beginning to crumble. But before Lucas could respond, the sharp sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse. Gabriel's heart sank as he turned to see a group of men stepping out of the shadows, their expressions cold and predatory. The leader, a tall man with a cruel smile, took a step forward, his eyes gleaming with malice as they flicked between Gabriel and Lucas. Well, 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 the man said, his voice dripping with mockery. So this is the famous brother I've heard so much about. I must say, I'm disappointed. I expected someone with a little more sense. Gabriel's pulse quickened. He could feel the danger radiating from these men. The kind of men who didn't need to make threats because their mere presence was a warning. Lucas's face went pale, and Gabriel could sense the shift in him, the moment when his brother's fear overwhelmed everything else. Leave him out of this, Lucas said, his voice strained but firm. He's got nothing to do with this. Oh, but he does, the man replied, stepping closer. You see, your brother here has been meddling in things he shouldn't. He's been asking questions, digging where he shouldn't be digging. That makes him our problem now. Gabriel felt a chill run down his spine, but he refused to back down. You're the ones who've kept him trapped in this life, Gabriel said, his voice steady. You've built your empire on lies, on stealing people's lives. But it ends here. The man laughed, a cruel sound that echoed through the empty warehouse. You think you can end this? You think you can waltz in here and save your poor, lost brother? Lucas belongs to us. He's not going anywhere. Lucas's eyes flickered toward Gabriel, and in that split second, Gabriel saw it. A silent plea, a moment of vulnerability that told him everything he needed to know. Lucas wanted out, but he didn't know how. He was trapped, just as Gabriel had feared, and now they were both standing on the edge of something they couldn't control. Without thinking, Gabriel stepped forward, putting himself between Lucas and the men. You don't own him, Gabriel said, his voice filled with defiance. You might think you control him, but you don't. He's not yours. The man's smile faded, his eyes narrowing with menace. You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts don't keep you alive in this world. Lucas knows that. He's made his choice. Gabriel's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing. He knew this was it, the moment that would either break them or bring them back together. Lucas, Gabriel said, his voice calm but urgent, you don't have to do this. We can fight them together. You're not alone anymore. Lucas looked at him, and for a moment, Gabriel thought he might reach out, that the brother he had lost so many years ago might finally break free. But then Lucas's face hardened, and he took a step back, his expression closing off. I can't do this, Gabriel, Lucas whispered, his voice barely audible. You don't understand. If I turn against them, they'll come after you. They'll come after everyone I care about. Gabriel's heart clenched. Lucas, I don't care about the danger. I care about you. We can end this, but we need to do it together. You don't have to live like this anymore. Lucas's eyes darted between Gabriel and the men closing in on them. His fists were clenched, his body trembling with indecision. The leader of the group took a step forward, pulling out a gun and leveling it at Gabriel's chest. I think we've had enough of this little family reunion, the man snarled. Lucas, You know what happens next. Either you finish this, or I will." Gabriel felt his pulse quicken as the cold metal of the gun seemed to freeze the air between them. His eyes stayed on Lucas, silently pleading with him to choose, to fight for something real, something that mattered. Lucas's breath hitched, his gaze shifting back to Gabriel. For the first time, Gabriel saw the raw fear in his brother's eyes. The fear of losing everything, of making the wrong choice and never being able to turn back. But Gabriel also saw something else. The flicker of resistance, the desire to break free. The tension stretched, the warehouse silent except for the slow, steady breaths of the men around them. Then, in one swift motion, Lucas made his choice. With a growl of determination, Lucas lunged forward, knocking the gun out of the man's hand. The clatter of metal on concrete echoed through the space as Lucas turned to face Gabriel, his eyes burning with resolve. "Run!" Lucas shouted, grabbing Gabriel's arm and pulling him toward the exit. Gabriel didn't hesitate. Together, they sprinted toward the warehouse doors, the sound of shouting and footsteps chasing them. Gabriel's heart pounded in his chest, but this time, he wasn't running alone. Lucas was beside him, fighting his way out of the shadows that had held him captive for so long. As they burst through the doors and into the night air, Gabriel felt a surge of hope, fragile but real. They weren't free yet, but they were running towards something better, something worth fighting for. The chase had just begun. Gabriel and Lucas bolted through the dark streets, their footsteps pounding against the pavement in rhythm with their racing hearts. Behind them, the shouts and threats from the men in the warehouse faded, but Gabriel knew they weren't out of danger yet. The adrenaline coursing through his veins kept him focused, but the reality of their situation weighed heavily on him. They had made a choice that could cost them everything. Lucas glanced back as they rounded a corner, his face tight with fear and determination. "They're going to come after us," he said, breathless, his voice ragged. "They won't stop until we're dead." Gabriel knew he was right, but something had changed. Lucas wasn't running away anymore. He was fighting. Gabriel could see it in the way his brother moved, in the way he had stood up to the men who had controlled him for so long. Lucas had finally chosen to break free, and that choice gave Gabriel the strength to keep going. "We'll figure this out," Gabriel replied, though he wasn't entirely sure how. "We just need to get somewhere safe." But as they turned another corner, a black SUV screeched to a stop in front of them, cutting off their escape. The doors flew open, and several men stepped out, guns drawn. Gabriel's stomach dropped. They were trapped. Lucas's face hardened, his eyes darting around for another way out. But there was none. The men closed in, and Gabriel felt the familiar weight of fear settling in his chest. They had come so far, fought so hard, and now it felt like everything was about to fall apart. One of the men, the same leader who had confronted them in the warehouse, smirked as he stepped forward. His gun was raised, aimed directly at Gabriel. "You really thought you could run from this, Lucas?" he sneered. "You're a fool, and now your brother's going to die because of it." Lucas's eyes flickered with panic, and he stepped in front of Gabriel, shielding him with his body. "It's me you want," Lucas said, his voice steady but laced with desperation. "Leave him out of this. He has nothing to do with it." The man chuckled, shaking his head. "That's not how this works. You dragged him into this, and now he's a liability. Both of you are." Gabriel's pulse raced, his mind searching for a way out, for anything that could save them. But the situation felt hopeless. The men had guns, they had power, and Gabriel had nothing. Nothing except his brother, and the truth they had uncovered together. Just as the tension reached its breaking point, a voice cut through the air. "Drop your weapons." The shout came from behind them, and Gabriel's heart leapt in his chest as he turned to see a group of armed police officers swarming the street, their guns trained on the men from the SUV. Mariana had come through. The investigation she had been working on had led the police directly to the scene. The men froze, their guns still raised but their confidence slipping. The leader scowled, his eyes darting between the officers and Lucas. "You think this changes anything?" he spat. "You think the law is going to protect you? You're dead no matter what." But Lucas stood his ground, his back straight, his voice calm. "Maybe," he said, meeting the man's cold gaze. "But I'm done running." The tension snapped like a rubber band. The police officers surged forward, disarming the men in seconds. Handcuffs clinked as they were hauled away, and the leader's sneering threats faded into the distance as he was shoved into the back of a police car. For the first time since the nightmare had begun, Gabriel allowed himself to breathe. Lucas turned to Gabriel, his face pale but resolute. "I should have done this a long time ago," he said, his voice raw. "I was so afraid of what they'd do to me, of how deep I was in, that I didn't see a way out." Gabriel stepped forward, placing a hand on Lucas's shoulder. "You weren't alone," he said quietly. "You never were. We were separated, but that didn't change the fact that we're family. That's why I couldn't give up on you." Lucas's eyes softened, and for the first time, Gabriel saw the walls between them begin to fall. The cold distance, the anger, the fear. It all seemed to melt away in the face of the truth. They had both been victims of the same lie, torn apart by a system that had tried to control their lives. But now, they had taken back their story. "I don't know what comes next," Lucas admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to fix everything I've done." Gabriel shook his head. "You don't have to fix it all right now. What matters is that you made the choice to fight back. That's what makes you my brother." Lucas looked down, his hands trembling slightly, as if the weight of his choices was finally catching up with him. "I thought I lost myself in that world," he said softly. "But you, Gabriel, you brought me back." Gabriel's chest tightened with emotion, but he managed a small smile. "We brought each other back?" For a long moment, they stood in the quiet street, the sirens and flashing lights fading into the background. They were still bruised, still scarred from the years of separation and the choices they had made. But now they were standing side by side, no longer divided by the lies that had once kept them apart. As the police cleared the scene and the city began to return to its usual rhythm, Gabriel and Lucas walked together, heading toward an uncertain but hopeful future. There were still battles ahead, legal consequences, emotional scars that would take time to heal, but they would face them together. For the first time in years, Gabriel felt like the pieces of his life were falling into place. The brother he had thought was lost forever was standing beside him, and together they had taken the first step toward rebuilding the family they had been robbed of so long ago. And as they walked into the night, Gabriel knew one thing for certain. No matter what came next, they would face it as brothers.